small nation stands at the center of a storm, its silence heavier than any gunfire. 40 years of one ruler, 72% of the vote, the numbers alone tell a story that reason cannot explain. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, a new generation is asking whether democracy still means choice when the ballot itself becomes a weapon. Yet what unfolded in Uganda after that moment would make even the loudest defenders of freedom fall completely quiet. You are about to hear what most headlines avoided saying out loud. The real stakes behind Uganda's election and why it matters far beyond its borders. By the end, you will understand how numbers that seem ordinary can expose the collapse of meaning behind modern democracy itself. And this is not a story for those who listen just for curiosity. Because if you stop here, you will never see how an internet shutdown became a mirror of fear. You will not grasp how votes turned into tools of control or how silence was mistaken for peace. You will keep believing that elections alone guarantee freedom when in truth they can disguise its absence. Missing this means misunderstanding what is happening not only in Uganda but across the continent, and why it should concern anyone who still believes in accountability. The first shock came quietly. Uganda's 2026 election did not collapse overnight, it unraveled in silence. 2 days before citizens went to the polls, the internet died. Not by accident, but by design. That single act set the stage for everything that followed. 40 years under President Yoweri Museveni, 72% of the vote, and yet the streets were filled with anger, not celebration. That contradiction was the first clear signal that democracy had turned into performance. The numbers said victory, but the faces in Kampala said disbelief. The internet blackout became the trigger. Journalists could not report, observers could not verify, citizens could not speak, and in that darkness truth itself became negotiable. This moment traces back to decades of power made immune to challenge. Each constitutional change stretched legitimacy thinner. Each protest answered with tear gas rather than reform. What began as control of information evolved into control of perception. The first to suffer were not politicians, but ordinary voters. Those who woke to find that their voices had vanished overnight. That is when the world, including the United Nations, began to pay attention. Because when information dies, accountability dies with it. It was at that turning point that a figure like Ibrahim Traoré drew attention, not for what he said about Uganda, but for what he represented to Africans watching closely. A young leader from Burkina Faso, openly challenging the notion that sovereignty means silence, became a reference point for those questioning how long the continent should tolerate elections without freedom. His presence reframed the debate: could African nations defend both stability and dignity at once? Inside Kampala, local journalists whispered of blocked phones, missing colleagues, and stories buried before reaching the air. One veteran reporter described standing at a polling station, unable to transmit footage of soldiers seizing ballot boxes. It felt, he said, as if the truth itself was under arrest. Across borders, civil groups in Kenya and Ghana echoed the same unease. They had seen this pattern: tight control, shrinking space, the language of order used to justify fear. Uganda was not an exception, it was a warning. From that moment, the narrative no longer belonged to one nation, it became continental. A mirror reflecting what power looks like when it stops being accountable. And from there, nothing could ever be called a simple election again. The spark was small, the internet went dark, and for a moment the world looked away. But inside Uganda, that blackout was the signal. Police trucks rolled out, checkpoints appeared overnight, opposition gatherings were broken before they began. The campaign season ended not with debate, but with silence. Then came the vote. Ballot boxes sealed under armed watch, journalists cut off from their editors, observers left blind. Results arrived faster than anyone could verify them. 71 to 72%, the government declared. 40 years of power renewed in a single announcement. Crowds flooded the streets, not to celebrate, but to question what they already feared: tear gas, gunfire, Arrests, streets that had once been filled with music turned into corridors of echoing fear. Social media gone, phones dead, voices reduced to whispers. In the absence of light, rumor became law. Families hid indoors as soldiers patrolled corners that once felt safe. And when calm finally returned, it was not peace that remained, it was exhaustion. Businesses reopened under tension, students whispered about who had disappeared, and every conversation began with, "Be careful." The aftershock rippled outward. Civil groups were suspended, journalists summoned for questioning. Online spaces, once alive with debate, now filled with ghosts. What began as an election had become a test of endurance, a struggle between silence and survival. Before emotions settled, the data began to speak. Numbers that once seemed abstract now described the weight of fear. Over 40 million Ugandans were affected by the nationwide internet shutdown, the largest blackout in East Africa's history. That figure alone reveals the scale. One government decision silencing an entire nation overnight. It was not a glitch, it was governance by disconnection. Then came the second signal, a 35% drop in real-time news output during the election week. Newspapers, radio stations, and online outlets all reported delays or censorship. The information vacuum created room for manipulation. Narratives diverged between official channels and underground ones. That gap, measurable in hours, defined the difference between order and panic. The third metric was human. Civil rights groups documented more than 800 arbitrary arrests, many never formally charged. Behind each number stood a person who vanished from routine life into uncertainty. For observers, it was the proof that control had shifted from persuasion to coercion. Put together, these figures form a grim geometry. Millions disconnected, hundreds detained, a nation reduced to controlled silence. This was no longer about one election. It was about the measurable erosion of public trust. And once trust collapses into data points, recovery becomes harder than resistance itself. Every story has another side, and this one is no exception. Supporters of President Museveni argued that Uganda's stability mattered more than any short-term outcry. They said order had to come first, that without strict control, chaos would swallow the region. To them, the blackout, the arrests, the restrictions, all were necessary tools to prevent violence. It is not an irrational view. Nations scarred by conflict often choose security before freedom. But that argument assumes control creates peace. History disagrees. Analysts pointed out that every clampdown deepened resentment. You cannot build trust through silence. The second defense claimed that Western critics, including the United Nations, had double standards, that they ignored their own allies' abuses while condemning African leaders. The criticism had weight. Selective outrage has long poisoned global credibility. Yet even if hypocrisy exists, facts remain stubborn. When journalists cannot report and citizens cannot speak, legitimacy rots from within. Uganda's defenders spoke of sovereignty. Its critics spoke of human rights. Both are essential, but when one devours the other, the result is neither strength nor independence, only isolation. In the end, the strongest nations are not those most feared, but those most trusted, and trust cannot survive under blackout. And then something shifted. The world stopped treating Uganda's election as just another regional dispute. Ibrahim Traoré's firm stance on sovereignty and accountability in Burkina Faso had already unsettled old assumptions. Now his voice echoed across borders. His defiance forced international observers to confront a harder truth, that the problem was no longer local mismanagement, but a continental pattern of eroding freedom disguised as order. The revelation came quietly. As UN envoys landed in Kampala, reports surfaced of secret negotiations, of Western diplomats divided between pressure and patience. Suddenly, the narrative expanded. It was not simply Uganda's story, it was a mirror for how power tests principles. If the global system tolerated this, what would stop it from happening again and again? From that moment, the discussion changed tone. Activists stopped asking if reform was possible and began asking how would dare demand it. The blackout had ended, but its shadow remained, proof that democracy can exist in form long after it dies in meaning. The consequences arrived in waves. At the state level, Uganda's government faced international scrutiny, but doubled down on rhetoric about sovereignty. Ministers defended the blackout as a security measure, yet behind closed doors, they confronted an economy losing investor confidence and growing diplomatic isolation. Regional partners began to question whether cooperation could survive when trust had been so publicly fractured. For businesses, the cost was immediate. Telecom companies reported millions in lost revenue during the shutdown. Small traders who relied on digital payments were paralyzed for days. Foreign investors, already wary, froze new commitments. In a global economy where credibility is currency, Uganda's political control came at an economic price. Among ordinary citizens, the toll was quieter but heavier. Families separated by checkpoints. Students unable to access classes. Journalists detained. The air of fear turned routine life into a negotiation between silence and safety. For many, democracy no longer meant choice. It meant caution. Across the region, the effect spread. Neighboring governments observed, learning that silence could be engineered and accountability delayed. Civil society groups across East Africa warned that if Uganda's model went unchallenged, it would become a blueprint for control. And so, by the time UN officials arrived, the story was no longer about one election, but about contagion. How repression travels faster than reform. The line between national crisis and regional precedent had already blurred. If nothing changes, the most probable scenario is slow suffocation. Uganda will maintain outward calm, elections will continue, and foreign partners will resume cooperation. But participation will shrink, faith in institutions will wither, and silence will become the default language of politics. It is stability without substance, survival without renewal. In the best-case outlook, internal reformers within government and civil society find a fragile alliance. Limited transparency returns, press restrictions ease, and young voters slowly rebuild trust. The internet remains watched but not weaponized. Progress would be cautious, reversible, but real. It would prove that reform does not always need revolution. The worst-case scenario is darker. Escalating repression, mass disengagement, and the normalization of fear. If the state continues to treat dissent as treason, it risks breeding resistance far more dangerous than protest. A generation that no longer believes in peaceful change. Whichever path emerges, the same truth holds. Prediction is less important than preparation. Understanding Uganda's trajectory is not about guessing the future, but about seeing how each decision now reshapes it. The next months will test whether power can learn restraint before people learn despair. For those watching from afar, the story is not just about Uganda. It is a mirror held up to every society where faith in institutions is thinning. So ask yourself, what does this mean for you, the person listening now? If you are among the attentive few, the researchers, the observers, the ones who refuse simple headlines, knowledge is your advantage, but vigilance is your duty. Keep tracking credible sources, comparing narratives, and questioning easy answers. If you are part of the affected many, the ones who feel politics through prices, jobs, and safety, awareness becomes protection. Prepare mentally for instability. Adjust expectations. Plan with realism, not fear. And if you belong to the silent majority, thinking this does not concern me, remember, silence never stays neutral. It chooses the side of whoever speaks loudest. When democracy erodes quietly, ignorance becomes consent. No matter which group you are in, understanding this moment means refusing to look away. Because those who see clearly are the ones history later thanks for noticing early. Solutions cannot remain slogans. After the blackout, the question was never who to blame, but who will act. Uganda's path forward, and Africa's, depends on transforming outrage into structure. First, At the level of leadership and state policy, governments must commit to measurable transparency, restore internet access during elections by law, publish audit trails for results, and invite independent observers with real authority. Success is not in promises, but in the visibility of the process. Second, institutions and businesses that operate within these systems, media outlets, telecom companies, civic groups, must design safeguards against manipulation, create protocols to preserve data, ensure redundancy, and protect reporters. Each working system becomes a shield for truth. Third, citizens and communities carry the longest responsibility. Awareness must turn into participation. Report abuses, demand explanations, share verified information, mentor the next generation in digital literacy. Real democracy survives when ordinary people refuse to outsource vigilance. And if the lessons of Ibrahim Traoré's stance in Burkina Faso tell us anything, it is that reform begins with moral courage, not size or wealth. Implementation, not inspiration, decides the future. Only when words become actions will freedom stop being a ceremony and start being a practice. In the end, the story returns to where it began, with a single leader standing before a continent watching. Months after the Ugandan blackout, Ibrahim Traoré spoke again, reminding Africans that sovereignty without justice is only a louder kind of silence. His words echoed the journalist in Kampala who whispered that truth felt under arrest. Both voices, one from the podium and one from the street, belong to the same struggle, the right to be heard. From the first shutdown to the last protest, this journey has traced the thin line between control and collapse. We have seen ballots counted but not believed, elections held but not trusted, citizens voting yet losing their voice. And now, as the dust settles, a question remains larger than any border. Can freedom exist without trust? The answer will not come from headlines or speeches. It will come from choices made quietly, daily, by those who still believe that justice is worth the risk. Because history never ends with silence, every ending carries an echo, and this one asks to be shared. Each listener will take something different from it: anger, reflection, or a renewed sense of duty. But what matters is that the story does not stop here. What happened in Uganda and what Ibrahim Traoré warned across Africa belongs to a collective memory that must keep expanding. If you believe this truth should travel farther, let it. Tell it to those who still think democracy is unbreakable, to those who trust numbers without asking what they hide. Let it move from one voice to another until silence no longer feels safe. And if you have a thought, a doubt, or a question, share it, debate it. Because change begins where conversation refuses to die. The continent deserves more than endurance, it deserves understanding. And together, by speaking, questioning, and listening, we make that understanding possible. Long after the cameras left Kampala, the silence stayed. Markets reopened, schools resumed. But something invisible had changed, the way people looked at authority and at each other. Conversations about politics moved to whispers, and laughter in public carried a caution it never had before. Democracy had not ended, it had simply withdrawn behind closed doors. Across Africa, young activists replayed the footage of Uganda's blackout like a cautionary tale. In Ouagadougou, students quoted Ibrahim Traoré, comparing his defiance to the fear they saw elsewhere. His name became shorthand for a question larger than borders. Can a continent rebuild trust without first confronting its ghosts? In one small newsroom, a journalist who had once hidden her notes under the floorboards reopened her computer. "We write again," she said quietly, because forgetting is the final censorship. Her words captured the fragile hope left behind, that even after silence, there can be speech. The storm passed, but its echo reshaped how truth sounded. It no longer roared, it persisted, steady and patient, waiting for those who would listen without fear. History never closes cleanly. It lingers in the gaps between what happened and what we choose to remember. Uganda's 2026 election will fade from headlines, but not from conscience. The lessons, written in data and silence, will keep resurfacing whenever power tempts itself to forget accountability. For Ibrahim Traoré, and for every leader watching, the challenge is not to win arguments with the West or the press, it is to prove that sovereignty can coexist with transparency, that independence means answering to your own people, not hiding from them. This idea, fragile yet radical, could redefine the African century. And for ordinary citizens, the work continues in smaller, quieter revolutions, teachers refusing propaganda, coders building tools against censorship, mothers teaching children to question authority with respect, not fear. These acts will never make headlines, but they will decide whether democracy returns as memory or as practice. One day the numbers, 40 and 72, will lose their sting. But the question they left behind will not. What is freedom worth if it can disappear overnight? Because in the end, democracy is not the sound of applause, it is the stubborn insistence on being heard.